Good.
My name is Ann Hilke. If I haven't met you, I direct spiritual services here at Haven for Hope. And as you probably know, we do all sorts of things inside of this building, from classes to worship to music and movies and to storytellers. So we have a biblical storyteller today, a dear friend of mine. He's a Lutheran pastor. He's also a professor at Texas Lutheran University. But he has been for, how long you've been doing storytelling?
Oh, 15 years.
15 years. And you're trying to even get better at it.
Every day, yep.
And that's why you're doing this today. It's being videotaped for your...
They'll probably put it up on the website, and so if people want to do a Bible study based on it, they can use that.
Cool. So, just so you know, and you've already figured it out, it is being videotaped. So if you're not comfortable with having yourself somewhere in that, you'll probably need to move to the back wall. I figured you already figured that out, though, because you saw him there, right? So you're cool? Otherwise, now would be a good time to relocate. Phil also asked, you notice there are a couple, he's moving. See? Give me a chance to move.
He wants to get in the shot. Oh, no.
Phil also noticed that a couple people have their Bibles open. That's really great, but it's also a little distracting for Phil. He can lose his place. So if you got your Bible open, he'd really appreciate it if you close it and maybe put it to the side. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. Phil is really good at this. So we were also born in the same day, so that's kind of cool. And Phil and I have known each other a long time, so I'm really excited for all of you to be able to participate in this wonderful offering. So thank you, Phil, for doing this, and enjoy. It's all yours.
So let me just explain briefly what I'm going to do, and then we'll just jump into it. In the time that the Bible came together, about 1% of the people could read. And so when they heard the stories of Jesus, it wasn't because they were picking up a Bible and opening up and reading it. It was because someone had learned it by heart and told it to them. So to me, it's amazing that you all in that back corner with those 7 Bibles there have more Bibles than the whole church had for probably the first 3 centuries that Christianity existed. So what I'm going to do is I spent a lot of time. I've spent about 3 years with the Gospel of Mark and learned the translation I use by heart. It's probably a different translation than you have. And I'll share it, and you get to be the audience and engage it however it feels appropriate to engage it. It'll be about an hour. I understand that's a long time. If somebody needs to get up and step outside and come back in, or step outside and not come back in, I totally understand that, and that's acceptable if that's all right with your group. All right? Yeah? You all here? All right? All right. Let me get a drink, and then we'll begin. The beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Anointed One, the Son of God. Just as it was written in the prophet Isaiah, "Look, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will pave your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths direct." And it was so. John, proclaiming in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of turning around for the pardon of sins. And the whole Judean countryside and all the Jerusalemites were coming out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan, publicly admitting their sins. Now John was clothed in camel's hair. He had a leather band around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. And he was saying, "The one coming after me is more powerful than I am. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the strap of his sandal. I baptize you with water. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." And it was so. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and he was baptized by John in the Jordan. And as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens ripped open, and the Spirit like a dove coming down on him. And there was a voice from the heavens, "You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am so pleased." And immediately the Spirit drove him into the desert. And he was in the desert for 40 days, tested by Satan and surrounded by wild beasts. And angels were serving him. Now, when John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God and saying, "The opportune time is fulfilled, and the empire of God has drawn near. Turn around and courageously trust in the good news." And going on along beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting nets in the sea because they were fishermen. And he called to them, "Hey, come after me and I'll make you into fishers of people." And they left their nets and they followed him. And going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, in a boat preparing their nets. And he called to them. And leaving their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired hands, they went off after him. And he went into a synagogue on the Sabbath. And he was teaching. And people were astounded at his teaching because he taught as one having authority, but not like the legal experts. And suddenly, there was in their synagogue a man occupied by an unclean spirit. And he cried out to Jesus, saying, "What have you against us, Jesus, Nazarene? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Shut up! Get out of him!" And the unclean spirit, convulsing the man and crying out in a loud voice, came out of him. And everyone was so astonished, they glorified God and said, "We have never seen anything like this. He has authority even over unclean spirits." And going out of there, Jesus went to the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying in bed with a fever. And they told him about her. And he went to the place where she was, and he took her hand, and he raised her up. And the fever, it left her. And she began to serve them. And that evening, as the sun was going down, people were bringing to him all the sick and the demon-possessed. The whole city was gathered at his door. And he healed many who were sick with various illnesses. And he drove out many demons, but he wouldn't allow them to speak because they knew him. And early the next morning, before the sun had even come up, he went to a quiet place by himself to pray. And Simon and those with him found him and track him down and say to him, "Everyone's seeking you." And he said, "Let's go to the next villages so I can proclaim there too, because that's what I came to do." And he went throughout the whole region, proclaiming in the synagogues and driving out demons. Now, as he was going through Capernaum, there was a man with leprosy. And he comes to Jesus, and falling before him, he pleads with him, saying, "If you want to, you can cleanse me." And Jesus, moved by compassion, stretched out his hand, and he touched him. And he said, I want to be cleansed." And immediately he was cleansed and his skin was made new. And becoming harsh with him, Jesus drove him out and said, "See that you say nothing to anyone at all, but go and show yourselves to the priests and offer the sacrifice Moses prescribed as testimony to them." But he went out and began to proclaim freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus was no longer able to go openly into the city, but was outside in deserted places, and people kept coming to him from everywhere. Jesus went into Capernaum after a few days. And the report went out that he was in a house. And so many people gathered, there wasn't any room, not even places at the door. And he was speaking the word to them. And some men came, bringing a man who was paralyzed, carried by 4 of them. And being unable to get to Jesus because of the crowd, they unroofed the roof of the place where he was. And digging through, they lowered down the mat on which the paralyzed man was lying. Seeing their courageous trust, Jesus said to the man, "Child, your sins are pardoned." Now some of the legal experts who were sitting there began thinking within themselves, "Why does he talk like this? He blasphemes. Who can pardon sins except God alone?" And Jesus, knowing that they were thinking these things, said, "Why are you thinking these thoughts within yourselves? Which is easier to say to the man who's paralyzed, 'Your sins are pardoned,' or to say, 'Rise, take up your mat and walk'? But so that you can know that the human one has authority on earth to pardon sins." And he said to the man, "Rise, take up your mat and go off to your house." And the paralyzed man rose. And picking up his mat, he walked out in front of them all. And they were all astonished and glorified God, saying, "Whew, we have never seen anything like this." And Jesus went again to the sea, and a large crowd followed him, and he was teaching them. And passing by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at a tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose, and he followed him. And so it is, Jesus reclining in the house of Levi, and there were many tax collectors and sinners with him. Now when the legal experts saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a healer. Those who are sick do. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Oh, and the Pharisees' disciples and John's disciples were fasting. And some people came to Jesus and said, "Why are the Pharisees' disciples and John's disciples fasting, but your disciples aren't fasting?" And he said to them, "Can the attendants of the groom fast while the groom is with him? While the groom's with him, they can't fast. But the day is coming when the groom will be taken from them. On that day, they'll fast." And he said to them, "Nobody takes a piece of new cloth and sews it on an old cloak, otherwise it'll pull from it the new from the old, and the rip will get worse. And nobody takes new wine and puts it in old wineskins, otherwise it'll burst the wineskins, and the wine is lost together with the wineskins. Instead, put fresh wine into new wineskins." And so it is, Jesus was going through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were making their way plucking heads of grain as they went. And the legal experts of the Pharisees said to him, "Why are your disciples doing what is not legal on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Haven't you ever read what David did when he had a need, when he and those with him were hungry? How he went into the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest, and he ate some of the consecrated bread, which is illegal for anyone to eat except the high priests. And he gave some to those who were with him." And he said, "The Sabbath was made for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. And so the human one is also Lord over the Sabbath." And he went into their synagogue, and he was teaching. And they were watching him closely because there was a man there who had a withered hand, and they wanted to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath in order to bring charges against him. And Jesus, aware of their hypocrisy, said to the man with the withered hand, "Rise to the center." Then he said to them, "Is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to restore a life or to put to death?" And they kept quiet. And looking around them with anger, grieved at the hardening of their hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched out his hand, and it was made whole. And going out, the Pharisees held a council with the Herodians against Jesus, how they might destroy him. So Jesus withdrew from there to the sea. And a huge crowd followed him from Galilee and from Jerusalem, from Idumea, from across the Jordan, from Tyre and Sidon. A huge crowd, when they saw what he was doing, followed him. And he told his disciples to keep a little boat waiting for him because of the crowd, because he healed so many people that anyone who had any illness would fall on him in order to touch him. And those who were possessed by unclean spirits would fall before him and cry out, saying, "You are the Son of God." And he'd rebuke them not to make him known. Jesus withdrew and went up on a mountain. And he summoned those whom he wanted to be with him, so that he could give them authority to drive out demons. And these are the 12 that he chose: Simon, whom he nicknamed Rock, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, whom he nicknamed Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And also Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanian and Judas the knife, who'd also betray him. And going down from there, Jesus' mother and his brothers came looking for him. And they were saying, "He's out of his mind." And the legal experts who came down from Jerusalem were saying, "No, he's possessed by Beelzebul, and he drives out demons by the ruler of the demons." And summoning them, Jesus said to them, "How is Satan able to drive out Satan? If a house is divided against itself, that house can't stand. And if an empire is divided against itself, that empire can't stand. And if Satan really did rise up and is divided and is against himself, then he can't stand, but is already at an end. Yet surely no one can enter into the house of the strong one and plunder his goods unless first he bind the strong one. Then he can enter into his house and take his goods. And he said to them, I tell you, this is the way it is. Every sin will be pardoned humanity. Their sins and whatever blasphemies they blaspheme. But whoever blasphemes, speaks against the Holy Spirit, is guilty of a sin to eternity. He said that because they were saying he had an unclean spirit. And Jesus was in the house, and his mother and brothers came and sent word to him. And those who were seated with him said, Jesus, your mother and your brothers are outside. And Jesus said to them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking at those who were seated around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Because all those who do the will of God, they are my brother and my sister and my mother. And Jesus went again beside the sea, and he was teaching many things in riddles. And in his teaching he was saying, here, look, a sower went out to sow. And it happened in the sowing that some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and gobbled it up. And other seed fell on rocky ground where there wasn't much dirt. And it sprouted immediately because there wasn't much soil. And the sun came out, and it was scorched, and it withered, so it didn't bear fruit. And other seed fell among the thorn plants, and the thorns grew up and choked it, so it didn't bear fruit. And other seeds fell on good soil and came up and grew and produced fruit, producing 30, 60, 100 per measure. And he said, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Now, when Jesus was in a house, those who were with his disciples were asking him about the riddle. And he said to them, to you has been given the mystery of the empire of God. But to those outside, everything comes in riddles. So at looking they look and they don't see. And hearing they hear, but they don't understand. Otherwise, they'd have to turn and be pardoned. And he said to them, oh, you don't understand the riddles either. How will you understand then the other riddles? The sower sows the word. Now there are those beside the way where the word is sown, who hear the word, but immediately Satan comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And there are those on the rocky ground. Those are the ones who hear the word and immediately receive it with joy, but they have no depth within themselves. And so when trouble or oppression come on account of the word, immediately they stumble. And there are those sown among the thorns. Those are the ones who hear the word. But the worries of this age and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things comes in and strangles the word. And it's without fruit. And then there are those sown on good soil who hear the word and receive it and produce fruit 30, 60, 100 per measure. And he said, nobody lights a lamp and puts it under their bed or under a box, but up on a lampstand. There is nothing that is hidden except to be revealed, and nothing a secret except to come to light. And he said to them, look at what you hear. By the measure you measure it out, it will be measured out and increased for you. Those who have more will be given. But to those who don't have, even what they have will be taken from them. And he said to them, the empire of God is like this. A man plants a seed in the ground, and he sleeps and rises night and day, and it sprouts and grows. He doesn't know how. On its own, the earth produces the fruit. First the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. And when it offers up its yield, he sends out the sickle, because the harvest is ready. And he said, to what should we compare the empire of God? Now, what riddle can we put it? It's like a seed of mustard weed, which when sown in the ground is the smallest of all seeds. But once it's sown in the ground, it grows up and becomes the largest of all shrubberies. And it sends out its branches, shoop, 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 so that the birds of the air can nest in its shade. And Jesus, he taught them many other things in riddles as they were able to hear it. And to his disciples privately, he would unravel everything. When the hour became late, Jesus told his disciples, let's go to the other side. And so they took him along as he was in a boat, and there were many other boats with him. And suddenly, a huge squall of wind came up, and the waves were beating beside the boat, and already the boat was filling, and the disciples were terrified. And Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they roused him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're about to perish?" And rising, he said to the wind and sea, "Quiet! Just shut up!" And the wind stopped. And there was a great calm. The disciples were terrified, and they said, "Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And they came to the other side, to the Gentile territory, the foreign country of the Gerasenes. And as Jesus got out of the boat, immediately he was met from the graves by a man with an unclean spirit who had his dwelling among the graves. No one was strong enough to bind him any longer, not even with chains, because he'd been bound often with fetters and with chains, and the fetters had been broken by him, and the chains torn apart, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And every night and day, among the graves and in the mountains, he would scream and slash himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him and said, "What have you against me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I'm putting you on oath by God, don't torment me." Because Jesus had been saying to him, "Unclean spirit, get out of the man." Jesus said to him, "What's your name?" And he said, "Legion is my name, because we are many." And he began pleading with Jesus not to drive him out of the countryside. Now, beside the place where they were was a hill on which a herd of pigs was feeding. And the demons pleaded with him, saying, "Send us into the pigs, so that we might enter them." And Jesus allowed it. And coming out of the man, the demons entered into the pigs. And the whole herd, about 2,000, charged down the hill into the sea and drowned in the sea. Those who'd been feeding the pigs, when they saw it, they were terrified, and they fled and reported to the people in the cities and fields what they had seen. People come to see what had happened. And they see the demoniac clothed in his right mind. he had been possessed by legion. And those who had seen it reported them how it happened with the demoniac and about the pigs. And they pleaded with Jesus to leave their territory. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the demoniac pleaded with him that he might go with him, but Jesus didn't allow it. He said to him, "Go to your house, to your family, and report to them what the Lord has done for you and how the Lord has shown you mercy." And he went throughout the 10 cities and reported what things Jesus had done for him. And everyone who heard it was amazed. They got back into the boat, and they went to the other side, back to the Jewish territory. And immediately he was met by a huge crowd, and he was by the sea. And a leader of the synagogue, Jairus by name, comes to him, falling down before him, and pleads with him urgently, saying, "My little daughter, she's at the point of death. Come, lay hands on her so that she might be restored and live." And Jesus went with him. And the whole crowd was following him, pressing him on all sides. Now there was a woman who had suffered from a flow of blood for 12 years straight. And she had endured many things under many doctors. Indeed, she'd spent every cent she had. But she was no better off, but rather worse. Hearing about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his cloak. Because she'd been saying, "If I just touch his cloak, I'll be made well." And the source of the bleeding dried up within her, and she knew in her body that she had been healed. Jesus knew within himself that power had gone out of him. And he said, "Who touched my cloak?" And the disciples said, "You see the crowd crushing you on all sides, and you asked who touched you?" But Jesus kept looking to see who had done it. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, trembling and afraid, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your courageous trust has saved you. Go off and be free of your affliction." Now, while he was saying this, some people came from the house of the leader of the synagogue, and they said to him, "Your daughter, she's died. Why trouble this teacher any longer?" But Jesus, overhearing it, said to him, "Don't be afraid. Trust courageously." And he wouldn't let anyone go with him except for Simon and Andrew and James and John. And they went to the house of the leader of the synagogue, and there was a great commotion, lots of weeping and wailing. And entering the house, Jesus said, "Why all this weeping and wailing? The child's not dead, she's sleeping." And they mocked him. And driving them all out, he took with him the father of the little girl and her mother and those who were with him. And he went to the place where she lay, and he took her hand, and he said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, rise." She got up. She started walking around. And she was 12 years old. And they were stunned with great astonishment. Oh, and Jesus told them not to tell anyone. And to give her something to eat. Going out from there, Jesus went to his hometown, and his disciples were following him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. People were astounded and began saying to each other, "Where does this guy get this? And what is the wisdom that's given to him that such works of power come about through his hands? Isn't this the woodworker? Yeah, the son of Mary? And aren't his brothers James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us?" And they were tripped up by him. And rising, Jesus said to them, "A prophet never lacks honor, except in his hometown, and in his family, and in his household." And he wasn't able to do even one work of power there. Well, except that he laid his hands on a few ill people and healed them. And he was astounded at their lack of trust. And Jesus summoned the 12, and he began to send them out 2 by 2, and he was giving them instructions saying, "Take nothing on the journey except a walking stick only. No beggar's bag, no bread, no coins stashed in your belt. But instead, strap on sandals and don't take 2 tunics." And he was saying, when you enter into a house and are welcomed, and they hear you, remain there until you go out from there. And if anyone doesn't welcome you or receive you, then shake the dust off your feet. It's testimony against them. And they went out 2 by 2 and proclaimed that people should turn around. And they were driving out demons. And they anointed with oil many sick people and healed them. Now, Herod heard about Jesus because his name was becoming known. And people were saying, "Oh, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead." And others were saying, no, he's Elijah. And others were saying, one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, he was raised?" See, earlier, Herod himself had bound John and arrested him on account of Herodias, the wife of Herod's brother Philip. See, because Herod had married her. And John kept saying, "It's not legal for you to have the wife of your brother." Now, Herodias held a grudge against John and wanted him put to death, but he wasn't able to, because Herod was afraid of John, knowing that he was a just and honorable man, and he was carefully protecting him. An opportune day came when Herod, on his birthday, threw a party in his own honor for all the leaders of Galilee and the military officers and the most important people. And it happened during the party that Herodias' own daughter came out and she danced. And Herod and those with him were pleased by her. And he said, "Ask me whatever you want, and I'll give it to you." And he swore an oath, "Whatever you want, up to half of my kingdom." And the little girl went to her mother and said, "Oh, what should I ask for?" And her mother said, "The head of John the Baptizer." And the little girl, with haste, went before the king and she said, "I want you to give me right now, on a plate, the head of John the Baptizer." Ooh. And Herod became profoundly sad. But because of those reclining with him and because of the oaths, he didn't want to refuse her. And so, summoning the executioner, he sent him to the jail. And he went there and cut off John's head, and he brought it on a plate. And he gave it to the little girl. And she gave it to her mother. Now, when John's disciples heard about it, they came and got the corpse and placed it in a grave. When those who had been sent out, remember them, returned, they gather around Jesus and they tell him all that they have taught and that they've done. And he said to them, let's go off to a deserted place and rest a while. Because there were so many people coming and going, they couldn't even eat bread. So they got into a boat, and they went to the other side, to a private place. But they couldn't escape notice. People recognized them and saw them and ran there through the cities and fields and got there ahead of them. When Jesus got out of the boat, he saw the crowds. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he taught them at length. Now, when it was evening, his disciples said to him, this place is a desert, and already it's late. Send them away so that they can go to the neighboring towns and villages and buy themselves something to eat. And Jesus said to them, "Oh, you give them something to eat." And they said, "Are we supposed to sell or buy 200 days' wages in order to get enough bread to feed these people?" And Jesus said, "Go see what you have." And they went, and they came back, and they said, 5 loaves and 2 little fish. Jesus said, "Good." And he had the people sit down group by group in the green grass. They were sitting in companies of 100 and of 50. And taking the bread, he looked to heaven, and he gave thanks and broke it and gave it to his disciples, and they distributed it to the crowd. And he did the same with the 2 little fish, giving thanks and giving it to them. And everyone ate and was satisfied. And the disciples gathered up 12 baskets full of leftover scraps. Now there were 5,000 Israelites who ate the bread. Jesus told the disciples to go to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving the crowd, he went up by himself to a quiet place to pray. In the middle of the night, the disciples were still halfway across the sea because the wind was against them. And about 4 a.m., seeing them straining at the oars, Jesus went towards them, walking on the sea. And he wanted to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they cried, "Ah, it's a ghost!" Because they saw him and they were terrified. And Jesus said, "Wow, take courage. I am. Don't be afraid." And he went towards them into the boat, and the wind stopped. And there was a great calm. And the disciples were terrified. See, they hadn't understood about the loaves. Rather, their hearts were hardened. And they came to Gennesareth and docked. And when Jesus came out, people recognized him and ran around to all the cities and fields and brought their sick to wherever he was. So wherever he was, in the cities, in the villages, in the fields, they would place their sick on mats in the marketplace and plead with him that they might touch just the hem of his garment. And as many as touched it were restored. And the legal experts surrounded him. And seeing that his disciples were eating bread with defiled hands, see, the legal experts, and really all the Judeans, don't eat anything unless they wash their hands to the elbow, thus observing the traditions of the elders. And they don't eat anything from the marketplace unless first they purify it. They have many other rituals which they've received and adhere to, like the cleansing of cups and pitchers and kettles. The legal experts and Pharisees said to him, "Why do your disciples eat bread with defiled hands? Why don't they walk according to the tradition of the elders?" And Jesus said to them, "How well Isaiah prophesied about you hypocrites, saying, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching teachings that are human teachings. Having abandoned the ordinances of God, you adhere to the traditions of elders? How well you abolish the ordinances of God in order to establish your traditions. For example, Moses says, honor your father and your mother, and whoever pronounces misfortune on father or mother must surely die. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever might have been a benefit to you from me is korban, that is dedicated to the temple treasury, ka-ching. You no longer allow him to do anything at all for his father or mother, thus annulling the ordinances of God with the traditions you hand on. And you do many other things like this. And Jesus summoned the crowds, and he said to them, hear me, everyone, and understand there's nothing from outside of people that by going into them is able to defile them. It's what comes from the inside that defiles. And when he was alone in the house, his disciples asked him about this riddle. And he said to them, you don't understand this either? And he said, nothing outside of people is able to defile. It doesn't enter here, but into the stomach, and it goes out in the outhouse. Right there, he's declaring all foods clean. And he said to them, it's what comes from the inside that defiles people. Because from the inside come the evil plots, sexual immorality, theft, murder, greed, adultery, acts of malice, deceit, indecency, desiring eyes, blasphemy, arrogance, senselessness. All these things come from inside people and defile them. Jesus went from there, and he went into the Gentile territory of Tyre. And he did not want anyone to know it, but he couldn't escape notice. And a woman came to him and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she pleaded with Jesus to drive a demon from her daughter. And Jesus said, let the children be fed first. It's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to dogs. And the woman said to him, yes, sir. But even the little dogs under the children's table get some of the precious children's crumbs. And Jesus said, for saying this, go. The demon has left your daughter. And she went to her house and found the little girl thrown on a bed, and the demon was gone. And Jesus went out from there, up through Sidon, towards the Sea of Galilee, around the 10 cities. And some people brought to him a man who was deaf and tongue-tied, and pleaded with him to lay his hands on him. And taking him off privately, Jesus put his fingers in his ears and with spittle, touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he groaned and he said, Ephatha. That is, be opened. And his ears were opened, and his tongue was untied, and he was talking articulately. And people were astounded, saying, this guy does everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the tongue-tied talk. And the word about him spread. And a huge crowd had gathered around him, and Jesus called his disciples to him, and he said, I have compassion on the crowd, because already they've been with me for days, and they're hungry. And if I dismiss them to their homes hungry, they'll become faint on the way. And some of them have come from a distance. And the disciples said, yeah, but how could anyone feed this many people with bread in a desert? And Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? And they said, we'll go see. And they came and said, we have 7 loaves. And taking the loaves, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed them, and he gave them to the disciples, and they gave them to the crowd. And they also had some little fish, and giving thanks to them, they distributed these also. And everyone ate and was satisfied. And the disciples gathered up 7 baskets full of scraps. Now there were 4,000 Gentiles who ate the bread. And Jesus dismissed them. This is our story for today. Thank you all. Thank you. Like, talk to you if you want, or if you're like, no, that's cool, we got it. That's fine too, or one-on-one, you could talk to me or whatever.
What about the rest of the story?
The rest of the story, I'm hoping to come and do it in the spring. Maybe we could do that. Okay. Do you really want to sit here for 2 hours? It's like 2 hours long, the whole thing. He dies in the end, I'll tell you that. Then he's raised, so.